So yeah, as I said before, we're back with these titles again, and this is kind of basically just a second part to that video I did before, where after we talked about the original Salem's Lot and the original Fright Night, now we're going to talk about their... I almost struggle to call either one of these a remake, because obviously the miniseries version, which is that this is just like a collection of King miniseries that I found, and I don't know how much you can see Salem's Lot at the very bottom, but this is our visual representation for it, I guess. It's basically, you know, another adaptation, and it's actually, as far as like adapting the novel goes, I feel like is almost, you could almost say significantly more faithful to the book, where it goes into a lot of the characters that the original movie didn't. So you can just see it as another adaptation rather than necessarily a remake of the '79 movie or miniseries. And the Fright Night remake, while it kind of got a bit of shit for people just not really wanting it remade to begin with, but also thinking it didn't live up, the thing that I really appreciate about this Fright Night is that in a lot of ways it's kind of just its own thing. Like they made enough like it's the same setup and the same character names for the most part. But it does so many things kind of differently that it kind of just feels like its own thing to me. So I always really appreciated it for that. But yeah, so this will be less like, you know, talking about the movies themselves against each other, but rather just which one is kind of the sort of different interpretation of what came before it, and how they each handle that in their different ways. So I think I want to start with Salem's Lot, which does, I talked about the original Salem's Lot having like a very cinematic feel to it, like how it's, when you're watching it like in its full form on like a Blu-ray, it doesn't feel like a TV event. It feels like a very cinematic movie. And this one definitely falls more into like almost like a cheap TV feel sometimes. Mostly in like the opening scene, because while we do start, the '79 one starts the same way the book does, where it's Ben and Mark kind of in the future of the story, and then we go back. This one sets up a new sort of separate end, like this, like the what's going on here at the beginning, and then when it circles back around to the end is basically an after the events of the book sort of thing. And it feels like a very, it's a little off-putting at first, because it feels like a very laughable attempt to open with a bang, as I guess you would say, where it's this very disorienting uh, opening of him finding James Cromwell, who's playing Callahan, and chasing him through a building and tackling him through a window and going to the hospital. And it's done so dramatically and it's so over the top. I don't quite know that they got the desired effect they were going to of hooking the audience as quickly as they possibly could to make them say, oh, what's happening? And there's a lot of action, so I'm intrigued, but I have no idea what the fuck is going on, so I need to watch and find out. I don't think it really hooks in that way, but it's, especially if you know the story going in. But like, it's still, I suppose to an extent I can appreciate the idea of let's get the audience hooked as soon as we can, even though slow burn is much more of what Salem's Lot feels like it's about, and a lot of the impact comes from. But once we do get past this opening, and we do start with Ben coming into town, it finds its footing relatively quickly. The only other way that they kind of fall into the sort of TV tropes you expect, especially the early 2000s TV tropes, like 2003, I believe is when it was. When I was praising the original, where he tells the story of how he went into the Marston house as a kid, and it was great because it was just being told to us as a story, and we can imagine it in our own ways, because our own imaginations will take off more than anything we can actually be shown, if it's implied strongly enough. But here they're doing the very obnoxious, amateur, flashing images thing, and everything's like really like jolted looking the way it moves, and it's trying so hard to be in our faces about it, and it's just obnoxious at the end of the day. Once again, you can see what they were going for and can appreciate it to an extent, but overall the execution is off, pretty way off. But like I said, it's really when in the whole picture of it though, these problems are just kind of like small things that come in and out. But for the most part, the way they tackle the rest of the material actually works pretty well, because we do have the one of the things about the book coming over that we didn't quite see as much in the original is really feeling like we're getting it from Ben's perspective mainly, especially by having Rob Lowe narrating as the kind of opening happens here. And like I said, we get more focus on characters that weren't in the '79 version at all, or just were very very small parts. Like Callahan, obviously, and Dr. Cody is a big presence here. Dud Rogers, Charlie Rhodes, the McDougalls. Um, but there's yeah, I was getting the McDougalls confused when I was talking about the original, but you know what I mean. Like I said, a lot of characters. But I do like, even though the Marston House flashbacks I feel are a little bit too, TV direction. There is, I do like the way the Marston House like looks in it, where it's almost like it's isolated, but yet it's looming over everything. Like there's that really great shot where Ben's in the cemetery at the grave, and it's just like behind him. And the way they utilized that, I did think was really well done, and it really kind of sets both the tone of the story itself, but also like the setting that we're looking at. And like the whole, because obviously one of the main stars of this story is going to be the town itself, like the people in it and the way it looks to us and the way it's presented to us. And obviously another character that's getting a lot of focus is going to be Straker, and I had talked about how it was amazing that they got James Mason, and James Mason was so thrilled to do it. And they kind of he did it in this perfectly sinister way, but they kind of made it a bit more of a, they kind of made it more of a prominent villain role when it kind of got to the end. Whereas this Straker is closer to Book Straker, particularly his outcome. And it's like, who can you get that's going to equal that? And yeah, Donald Sutherland is probably as good as you can go. Because the great thing about what Donald Sutherland does here is like, he's definitely got that. It feels like he's got everything down in a nutshell. In regards to this character, he's got like a sophistication to him, but he's also kind of creepy in a way. And these things can go back and forth, or he can be sophisticated and creepy in sometimes the same moment. And then obviously when it gets closer and he's like they're in the house with him, then he gets to go like full on hammy. And yet it still somehow works to where he can find. Obviously Sutherland is experienced enough to where he knows how to go ham without going too far. So everything feels reined in when it has to, but he can also kind of really go for it if it calls for it. And I thought he did that pretty much perfectly. And then, of course, we have a new Barlow and Rutger Hauer, which is very funny as far as Rutger Hauer and vampires go, because it's him reuniting with Donald Sutherland after Rutger Hauer was also the head villain in Christy Swanson's Buffy the Vampire Slayer before the series. And it's only he and Sutherland were enemies in that case, rather than Barlow and Straker here. And yeah, Howard definitely, even though it's another case of he might seem almost too obvious of a choice, especially since he'd already kind of done it, in a movie that was much more, comedic about itself and self-aware about itself. But still, the key Barlow scene, if you're doing it not the way it was done in the '79 movie, where we're having Barlow come in as kind of an almost sophisticated sort that can like lure you in, rather than be like actually monstrous in appearance the way he was before. The key moment, obviously, is the scene at the dump with Dud Rogers, where we see exactly how he's changing people and how he sort of lures them in with promises and stuff like that. And I feel like it maybe would have been a more effective scene if he was more in the shadows, like, the whole time. Like, if his face was kind of obscured by the darkness. But we get a really good look at him in this scene, and it's like, that is something I kind of wished had carried over from the '79 version, which was keeping him as shrouded in mystery as possible and not seeing him for a long time. And it's like, there is a way to let him interact with the characters and still not completely show him. Which I think would have made his reveal towards the end when he's like crawling on the ceiling much more dramatic and terrifying. So it didn't feel like there was much build up to it. It was just like he gets one scene and then he disappears until he's prominent towards the climax. Um, but as far as like his performance and his presence itself really works. Um, and as far as there being like a creative factor, because I talked about the main thing that really stands out about the '79 one is that it's still genuinely terrifying, and it's like that's kind of because you can still like there's so many horror movies that aren't necessarily scary anymore, but yet you can still identify that they're extremely well made regardless. And this is a story though to where it's like that's such a prominent thing. Like if it's gonna feel like something is like significantly missing, even if it is well made, can it be scary or at least creepy, consistently? And yeah, it does have its moments where we were talking about like. Well, there's some moments that don't work as well as they could have. Like I said, it's the scene where Ryerson has to bury Danny Glick is absolutely terrifying in the book, and the '79 movie did it quite well. In here, it might be a little overdone, even though the way he freaks out is similar to the way book Ryerson freaks out. And there's that great edit when he actually opens the casket and we see this horrific looking figure, but it's actually just one of like Danny's or not Mark's figurines, and it's so little clever edits like that can kind of add a change of pace to it, even if it does kind of take away from the impact of the scene itself a little bit to kind of undercut it with stuff like that. But it's but there's still some really great creepy stuff here, like the scene in the woods. The great moment with the flashlight is very creepy, where it's just coming out. It sort of reminds me of a similar. There's a movie from like 2014 called Last Shift that also has a very terrifying scene involving a flashlight that just makes all the hairs on your arms stand up. And it's one of those cases where like when a flashlight is shining out of the dark and you don't know who or what is holding it. That's always going to be terrifying to me. So I thought they pulled that off really well, without necessarily the memorable jump scare that was used in the '79 movie, but still. And then there's also a moment in the story itself, the book and both versions, where it's hard. It would be hard to mess up on the scary factor because it's just in the material already, and it's this moment where. Obviously, Burke takes in Ryerson after he's seemingly sick, and then there's Burke just listening while it sounds like Ryerson's like letting people into his house, and they're like laughing and all that. It's especially terrifying when you know what exactly it is that's going on. And so that's that kind of thing. Also, is just always going to carry from the material, and this does it well enough. Like you can congratulate this on not fucking it up. Is the best you can do. So. Then eventually we do get to our midpoint here. And like I said, the whole story revolves around build up and kind of bringing in the townspeople and setting up all these different things. And then eventually we kind of bring, Straker and Barlow in a little bit as like, the Glick brothers disappear and all that. And then we eventually get to this halfway point to where all shit breaks loose and then everything else happens, like the entire second half happens. And there's a lot kind of happening all at once here. We do have like everything going on with the Glicks and like, the window scene, the whole thing with Ryerson and Matt and that whole thing. When Ben's in jail with Tibbets, and that gets extremely crazy as Tibbets is changing in the cell and coming after him. Even if the effect is not flawless of Tibbets coming through the vent, still the fact that like everything kind of feels like it's happening all at once, still kind of gives it this feeling of like everything is like literally going to hell, and like this unstoppable force has arrived and is growing more and more out of control, and so as long as that's there, I think it's succeeding well enough. There's also some stuff they throw in there that feels kind of cheap, like the other King references. Like there's a dog called Cujo, which is kind of it's the stuff that's just thrown in. You can tell is there for the sake of being there, and it might kind of throw you out of it a little bit. There's a bit more of a subtle one, where when they're at the bar and he's talking to Matt, and "Stand By Me" is playing in the background. The song "Stand By Me" is playing in the background, which obviously we can associate with King. So I think I like that one more than just flat out saying, "Hey, there's a dog named Cujo. Aren't we clever? Who's gonna ever notice that?" Uh, but yeah, but then obviously once we go into that second half after everything's broken out, it does start to get more. It feels like it breaks more away from like the TV restrictions and does start to feel a bit more cinematic in the way that the '79 one did. Um, and like I said, we get stuff like Rutger Hauer on the ceiling, and when we get the more glimpses of Barlow, but the way that Barlow's never overused, which is always suits as much as it does. Like I said, regardless of how the dump scene was handled in this one, he's still there a short enough amount of time that when he's there, he completely and fully has our attention, and potentially our fear as well. But then we also have some moments that the '79 one didn't go into, like I was talking about the Charlie Rhodes character, and there is the horrifying scene in the book when he goes onto the bus and all the kids are kind of coming at him, and they adapted that pretty directly for this version, and it does. You wouldn't think so, like I said, especially with budgetary reasons and all that, or TV restrictions, I guess, more so. It's nearly as terrifying as you might have imagined it reading the book, when he goes onto the bus and all the kids are kind of coming at him in almost like a wave of sorts. And another scene that feels particularly cinematic is when Eva is changed by Ed, and there's the whole thing with like the wedding and all that. And there's something so like I said, sort of horrifyingly beautiful about this scene, I guess, where he changes her, but she's like fully accepting of it by that point. So additions like that, as far as what we didn't see in the '79 version, or they didn't take it to that degree, it feels really well done also. But we do have some moments here where, like, some of the book's I love the book, I really do, but it's not without, some shortcomings. And some of those have come over into this adaptation, like the whole chalk thing. When they used the chalk to identify where Barlow is, always felt like really contrived to me, like even in the book. And it feels just as contrived in this version when they try to put it in there, but something they did carry over, and even though we do get more of a... I do love the idea of when he stabs Barlow and we see like all the, different eras of people and all that. But still, as usual, it's a pretty simple way to take out the main villain of the story. You just gotta go in while he's sleeping and stab him, that's all there is. So this one kind of carried over, in a way, something carried over from the '79 one, which was having Susan kind of be like one of the last interactions before it gets into like the whole town is the conflict here, if you even want to call it that. It's more of a wall, really. But where he has like an actual confrontation with her, rather than I believe in the book it's pretty much just the same way that Barlow went. You just went in and had to stab her. So the fact that both adaptations took the route of let's make him having to kill Susan more dramatic, and I thought that actually works in a big way, like dramatically and story wise and otherwise. It kind of feels like it gives it a bit more of a payoff. Even though Susan's significantly more missing from the '79 one, and here she does get to be much more prominent. And Samantha Mathis does feels like this whole one in general is pretty well cast, with Rob Lowe carrying it pretty well. And like I said, all the side characters, Cromwell as Callahan is especially a great choice. But it does sort of, I don't know, that whole addition of them tracking down Callahan and actually giving it closure, I can see where that would be kind of a good idea on paper, but I do think the open-endedness of the story otherwise, where it's just kind of him and Mark like knowing what their mission is a bit more satisfying, I guess. And it seems like it'd be the other way around, where the one with the ending with more closure would be more satisfying, but I don't know that it entirely works in this case, but that could just be me. And yeah, there are some, slip-ups throughout this adaptation. Like, obviously, it's very, 2003 TV adaptation, in many cases as far as, like, the direction goes. And there's also some erratic editing. There's, like, some scenes that feel like they're 5 seconds long. And and I think they do that to kind of feel like they're building up to something, or they want the audience to feel like they're building up to something, but it just feels very choppy and weird. And there's a lot of there's a lot of lines that feel like really tacked on, like when Eva talks about getting married to Ed or whatever, and she just kind of says she says that they're getting married. It's almost like an "oh by the way," and like nobody reacts to it, and it just feels sometimes it's just weird. But I mean, overall, I do think that it's actually a pretty solid adaptation with some decent and not so decent additions or subtractions. Um, and like I said, it's well cast and it's just as engrossing. But like I said, it may be more of a victim of being a TV adaptation than the other one was. But I still think this one's fine. And like I said, most of the problems are just kind of like mundane things. Even when I was talking about when it feels very obnoxious the way they present the Marston flashbacks when he was in the house as a kid, when it kind of goes into it more during the climax and we kind of stay in those a little longer, then it kind of has more of the desired effect where it feels more like this almost memory that might also be crossing over with a nightmare depending on how well he remembers it. And like I said, is he remembering things the way that he initially thought, or the way they actually went? But yeah, it's fine. I mean, I'm sure it's probably easy, much like Fright Night. I'm sure it's very easy to hate on because it's one of those things where you just know it's not going to necessarily be on the same level of quality. But I really try not to like automatically dismiss things just because I know they may not be better than their predecessor, because they can still be good in their own right, and I do think this one is more so than it isn't. But but yeah, like I said, it feels like it's a significantly more faithful adaptation of the book, all things considered, which is interesting to go into the Fright Night remake, because like I said, it barely feels like a remake even, because they made so many changes, but not necessarily for better or worse. They're just changes. Like I said, it's really a different movie, and immediately we start off with changing the setting. In what I think is a pretty clever way, where we have the Vegas setting, where it's the whole thing where when you're in Vegas, a lot of people work night shifts, so if the guy next door has his windows blacked out, who's going to think anything of it? It's sort of the same thing like when it was the way the original set it up, about how, vampires aren't real, so who's going to think that? Like that's the key to them doing what they do, is just convincing people, oh, that's normal. Or like, oh, people aren't going to associate that with what it actually is. And the whole idea of them just being totally isolated in like this desert, this neighborhood that's like right in the middle of like a desert. And the way that they're able to use like the whole idea that Jerry doesn't necessarily have to wait till it's actually nightfall to go out, as long as it's like sunset and the sun is safely out of sight, but the sky may still be a little lit up. He can just hang out in the front yard and like fuck around in his garden or whatever. And it's like that's where we find him meeting Toni Collette and Imogen Poots, and it's like it's so interesting to know what this character is, but yet see that it's not quite night, but it's not really daylight either. He's just kind of he finds this little sweet spot to come out right before it's actually nightfall, and just visually it looks really interesting. But that brings us to our new Jerry, who is Colin Farrell, which I think is a brilliant casting, because the whole thing is that because the thing about Colin Farrell was obviously it was maybe not so much now, but like back in the day he had that sort of like bad boy image. So the thing here is like when we see Colin Farrell as Jerry, we can see immediately this guy is sinister. Like he looks really sinister and potentially threatening, but at the same time, because Colin Farrell like has that charm that oozes out of him through this, it's like when we see Toni Collette and Imogen Poots like interacting with him, it's like the fact that he looks so sinister isn't a dead giveaway that he's a vampire to these people. It adds to his appeal. And makes him look more like mysterious to them. Like the more of an outsider he seems to be. And I think the fact of just, the casting of Colin Farrell, where just like his appearance is eventually going to be like all he has to do is stand there, regardless of what he looks like, and people are going to, especially women, will be drawn to him. And you can almost see people like be easily sucked in by him. Like I said, the more sinister he seems with the way he's playing the character, the more easy it is to buy that they could also just see that, like, that's just even more alluring to them, rather than putting them off. So I thought he was a really brilliant casting choice, in my opinion anyway. But we also have Anton Yelchin being Charlie, who is very easy to buy in this whole role of, he's kind of like, he's very quick to figure things out, but he's kind of in that middle ground of, he's hesitant at first but also very adamant about going right into it at the same time, where there's like a balance to that. But he doesn't figure it out as quickly as 1985 Charlie does, William Rysdale Charlie does. Because it's more Ed that ends up figuring it out, who is Christopher Mintz-Plasse now. And the thing here is, like, the way he, like, immediately knows. And, yeah, there is kind of a playful thing here where, Charlie makes the comment, like, Jerry's a terrible name for a vampire and stuff like that. But much like the original movie, it acknowledges some of those things and maybe some of the tropes, but still feels like it's taking the horror pretty seriously. So that's something that they didn't really change. And this was in an era we were getting much more in the self-aware territory. So the fact that they were able to refrain from that, or at least rein it in a little bit, and kind of keep the horror pretty straight as far as it goes. And that especially comes through with the character of Ed, who is changed, like Ed's changing happens so early. It's basically like the portion of the movie in the original movie where like Charlie was figuring everything out, and then he came into the bedroom and there was a whole confrontation and they set it up. That time in this movie is used to set up Ed, which may not seem like it's too much of a payoff because we just never hear about Ed again until he shows up at the end. But what they do with the Ed character here is very interesting because they make him like where Ed in the original movie was like a comedy relief character turned the campy character to contrast Chris Sarandon's, straight-faced way of doing it. Here, they make Ed like a real tragic figure, where we have this whole story where he and Charlie's friendship is kind of like drifted apart, and Ed is seen as like an outcast to everybody else. Like, he'd rather hang out with the cool kids like Dave Franco. And so Ed is basically like rejected from like the world, it feels like. And the fact that Jerry uses that to like lure him into it when he bites him, just makes Ed like this really sad character. And there's even that moment when he actually has to kill Ed at the end, and Ed like kind of comforts him, and the real Ed comes out at the last minute before he vaporizes and like comforts him about the fact that he had to kill him. And I thought that was really interesting to make Ed like a tragic character, and that it actually kind of works even with as little as he's here. And the way they're also building up this scene where it's like, the way they play with the tropes of like expecting a jump scare or stuff like that, when Ed's explaining to him like the reasons he thinks Jerry's a vampire, and him like all the footage he's set up and stuff like that. There's moments like when he's like, just the way they handle those expected moments, like jump scare moments, like when Ed like walks into another room and he just stops talking, and Charlie like kind of anticipates and he calls his name, and there's just silence, and then it's like the score gets really sinister, and it's like when you're expecting like a jump scare, Ed just walks back out and just keeps talking like he never stopped. Like there was no interruption. So every now and then like that you can see them playing with the tropes in a way that's not too overblown, or a way that's too condescending to the material itself. So I like that they were able to hang on to that from the original movie, where they were able to play with it without being condescending to it. But then we get some really great scenes here. Some of my favorite scenes in the movie, where it's Charlie and Jerry interacting, and we get this really great scene when Jerry comes over to ask him for beer, and they play with the whole thing of like, we're trying to figure out exactly how much he knows about what Charlie already knows. So they play with the whole thing of being invited in or not being invited in. So he just like hangs out by the door, and just the way he talks makes himself like so incredibly obvious. But it's like we were talking about the original movie, because he knows how much he can get away with, because of how outlandish the fact that he is a vampire is. It just kind of gives him the freedom to like fuck with Charlie in any way. So this dialogue between them and the way it kind of ramps up the tension between them, like I said, it's like the grudge we see between them so early in the original movie. Here it's much more of like a simmering thing. And I love both approaches to that, and it works just as well here, I think. So I really love that kind of stuff. And then we have a very different Peter Vincent going on with David Tennant, who's having a lot of fun here. And I do like the approach of him being a character that's like pretending to be all this, but behind the scenes, like when we see him dropping his facade, he like takes the wig off and he takes it, even his facial hair is fake. It's like he's really, really into the vampire thing, but for the most part, his actual persona is a facade. I like it, and I love how much fun Tennant's having with it, but who's also perfectly cast. But I do kind of miss the idea of it, like coming from like a love of old horror movies. Like old horror movies basically save the day, because they just kind of follow the same rule book. So that whole thing of Peter Vincent being like, you know, an old actor now turned, you know, host of public access Fright Nights or whatever, it is missed quite a bit, but still, Tennant's having enough fun with it that we can go along with him and like the character well enough. Just maybe not as as an endearing way as Roddy McDowall's portrayal of the different character almost entirely. And there is it is worth noting there is a lot of noticeable stuff kind of being. This was in the era where like 3D was still a thing for some reason. This was like a year or two before it died, thankfully, because it was so pointless. And I think this is one of the ones that was like converted, and obviously the conversions looked significantly worse. So there's a lot of stuff that's just being thrown at the camera for the sake of throwing it at the camera, which is sometimes I forget that this came out in that era. So sometimes I'm kind of thrown off when I watch this again, and it's like they're just just shit's being thrown at the camera for no reason, or like being front and center to the camera for no reason. But that's, you know, easy enough to get past because it's not too abundant. But it's like I said, it's almost like, you know, a charming sort of cheese factor. And it's weird to say that about a movie that only came out in 2011, which, you know, in the long run wasn't that long ago. I know 9 years seems like a very long time, and 2011 does not feel that long ago. But it's and this year's like practically almost over, so it's gonna be 10 years old soon, which is insane. It makes you feel like it's yeah, but what I do love about it being in 2011 now, as opposed to 1985, is bringing in technology and working with it a little bit and having some fun with it. Like, another joke that kind of feels a bit self-aware and talking about tropes is like the way a lot of people in old movies just automatically know how to pick locks, whether it be you know, a hairpin or a credit card or whatever, and you just open, like anything opens doors. And so there's this great bit where he actually like Googles how to pick a lock to get into Jerry's house, and it doesn't even work. I think he ends up finding a hide key that actually gets him in. So that's a very clever joke that I like a lot. And the whole idea of like the video footage and like seeing, you know, Jerry get in and out of his truck, but he's not showing up on the video footage, is some really cool additions to that. But talking about this scene where he goes into Jerry's house, this is a whole segment that I really love. It's not at all something that's in the original movie. It's this whole idea that instead of like immediately killing them, these vampires, like the type that Jerry is, hang on to his victims and he locks them up so he can just like feed on them over time. So there's this whole amazing sequence where it's an age-old scene. We've seen the scene a million times before, but yet it gets me every time. Like, it gets me so it gives me so much anxiety every single time, where we have the age-old scene of somebody is in a house or a room that they're not supposed to be in, and they're looking for something, and right while they're in the middle of it with seemingly nowhere to go without getting caught, the person comes home or comes back. And then it turns into a whole thing. And the way that's just the way this scene starts off. Then we get the whole him having to go in there and try to get her out. And then Jerry's coming back into there also, so he has to hide in another room. And it's like just suspenseful moment after suspenseful moment after suspenseful moment until he finally gets her out. And even once he gets her out, they've got to somehow get through Jerry's living room and out the front door without getting caught. And there's two brilliant moments here that pay off this scene, because this is a very long, suspenseful scene. Starting with him breaking into the house and almost getting caught multiple times, also trying to get her out. It's like, with this much tension, you need a big payoff. And this moment when they walk out of the house and she walks right into the sun and just explodes is like an amazing payoff, because it's so sudden. And like even though we know she's been bitten, it's like there's no real like proof that she's really changed yet. So when she walks right into the beam of light and that just happens immediately, it's like so unexpected and jarring, but it's such a perfect payoff. And then the second brilliant moment to that is seeing Jerry like just in the shadows, having witnessed this, and it's like, did he know they were there the whole time? Did he know Charlie was there the whole time? And that like adds a whole creepy factor to the entire like set piece of this whole scene. So that I love that sequence so much. And then obviously we eventually get to the point where, as we talked about before, even with Sarandon's, as cool and stoic as he was, eventually Jerry will get reckless. And so there's this moment when like he changes Dave Franco is kind of the starting point of the shit hitting the fan, and he does the whole thing of I don't know how much as far as liberties go with like the vampire rules, but his whole thing of I don't have to worry about being invited into the house if there's no house, so he just blows up the house. But which doesn't matter because they escape anyway. But then we get another great scene where we get this chase scene, this car chase that's entirely in the confines of the car. Like, we don't go outside of the car during this chase sequence. And the whole time the camera's just in the middle, revolving around it in the middle, and kind of getting this all-around shot of Tony Collette in the driver's seat and going forward, and then Jerry getting closer and closer from the back, and then around. And it's this really great scene that eventually leads to the big cameo, where it's obviously the most self-aware moment in the movie, where they get into, if nobody is familiar with the original movie or Chris Sarandon, this might seem like a really weirdly pointless moment of them getting into a car wreck with this other dude who's there just to be killed by Jerry. But of course, it's Chris Sarandon, and and seeing new Jerry, kill old Jerry, it's sort of like a it feels like a nice combining of the worlds, and it's like kind of a sort of, Chris Sarandon actually showing up feels like we're getting respect from the original source itself, and kind of gives it this nice sort of transitioning from one movie to the other, which is nice. It could seem very cheap, like cheap fan service, but it works on me. The cheap fan service doesn't always work with me, but I'm willing to accept this. But then we also get a moment of once again, some people may think it's obvious and may think it's too blatant, but I actually kind of love the choice in product placement, where it's like when you see, it's like it almost feels like it's intentionally doing almost a parody of product placement, where we're getting like the realty company, I think it is, that's on the sign that we see Tony Collette with, and eventually Jerry gets stabbed with one of these. And as he's crawling around in the night, the only thing we see sort of fumbling back and forth is this sign with this company's name on it. And it's, there's some good, I know people get way bent out of shape when it comes to product placement in a lot of cases, and there are times where it can be like really overbearingly blatant, I don't know. This is just so sort of cheeky in a way that I'm like, once again, I just fully embrace it the same way I do the fan service of having Chris Sarandon be killed by Colin Farrell. Um, yeah, so I'm just this movie really won me over in a way that I wasn't expecting to, especially with how much respect I have for the original movie. Like I said, I really just kind of respect this for being its own thing and having its own individual great scenes in it that have really nothing to do with the original. They're just its own thing. But we do get more into familiar territory as we get closer to the end, where we do get the club scene where he changes her, and then they go back to the house and they take the windows out and all that. But of course, where we had the amazing sort of practical effects in the original, now we're much more CGI heavy. And being CGI heavy over practical isn't always like, it's not like an inherently bad thing. It's just more often than not practical looks better. And so this, and CGI can come off maybe a bit lazy or a bit cheap or something, but here it does more, which is kind of a confusing thing because you hear so many stories about how practical was actually cheaper than CGI, but I don't know. Sometimes I hear CGI is cheap, sometimes I hear it's expensive. I guess it goes from project to project. I have no fucking idea. But as far as how it looks in this movie, I don't think it looks bad. Like, it's obviously it's heavily used, but I don't think it necessarily looks that bad. Like the only thing that I kind of wish had been more practical, if I had to choose one thing, would be when Jerry changes. Is obviously it's a very CGI face. It's like Colin Farrell under a lot of makeup probably would have been cooler. But as movies go, especially in this era, if they're going to do one thing CGI, they're going to do everything they can in CGI. Unfortunately, so that's just the era that we're in now, I guess. Every now and then there'll be plenty of movies that that's an oxymoron, but that find ways to combine them, and a lot of times people use CGI pretty invisibly, like people don't even notice. But when you do notice, you kind of long for the more classic approach. Um, and a lot of the stuff that's meant to be 3D, you can tell is pretty CGI for obvious reasons. But still, the whole movie is so well made in itself. It's maybe a little too dark visually in a lot of cases, but still, but that also kind of gives the vibe of like the isolated nature of the setting itself. Probably has a lot to do with that. So, but overall, it is extremely well made. The suspenseful scenes are very suspenseful, and there's plenty of them. And like I said, the casting is great. Toni Collette is really great also, with Charlie's mom getting much more of a focus here and kind of a bit more of a... Because it's almost like it almost lends itself to her being like a potential... Jerry being a potential romantic interest to her because she's single and looking. And he's Colin Farrell. It feels like it puts her in much more danger than we saw her in the original movie. She didn't just leave dinner in the oven and leave for the climax. She's in genuine danger and eventually hospitalized before the climax hits. But yeah, so all these additions and all that stuff, like I said, basically makes it feel like its own movie to me. So I really like hardly go in, like really the only reason I even compare it extensively to the original is for doing stuff like this where we're just that's the point of what we're talking about. But when I'm just watching the movie to watch it, I'm not really even thinking a whole lot about the original, even though the original is potentially objectively a better movie. But I mean, if somebody wanted to argue, if somebody thought that was arguable, that would be realistic to me. But I know people were very quick to hate on it for the simple fact that it was technically a remake of Fright Night, and Fright Night's fan base is very loyal. And like so pretty much anything would have maybe felt like it was soiling it, especially something that went so CGI heavy when the practical effects are such a massive reason of why the original movie is as effective as it is, on top of many other things. But I mean, if the climax of the original movie wasn't as good as it is, that's a pretty important piece of the puzzle. So, but I really really like this one, quite honestly. And like as far as remakes go, I do think it's like I would say it's a better adaptation of its material, even if it's not a loyal adaptation. the idea that it was able to take the concept and have many similar moments and scenes, but also the stuff that it was able to add to it in its own way, and to make its own really suspenseful story, is really impressive. But and yeah, while this Salem's Lot is more loyal to the book, I may actually. Well, yeah, I do absolutely prefer the one that maybe isn't as loyal, but still is. Yeah, but like I said, I'm still impressed with the way they were able to, even with the TV restrictions, be as cinematic as they were, both of them. But I thought the original pulled that off much more. So yeah, so I guess that's gonna be this one. So the next thing, I think I know what the next thing is, but I'm not positive, so I won't say yet. But I feel like we're getting closer to the end of this. So once that comes, then like I said, November will be here, and whatever happens, happens. So until whatever is next, that's it for this.